How exciting it must have been during the early days of school, when both parents and children attended class together, learning all the marvels of Sierra. As I sat at the controls, I recalled my duties in the early days as a watcher. Now, for whatever reason, I wanted something to do concerning those responsibilities. I understood what they were, but I didn't remember physically performing any services while in that office. Bart and I were in the heart of that discussion when I thought of David. David, I called him Dave, was a dear friend of mine. Dave was a chief of a tribe of Cheyenne Indians who preferred to live the traditional ways on a planet called Prairie. Yes, we still called them Indians. In fact, many of the tribes preferred that designation, although each tribe identified with their tribal names such as Cherokee, Sioux, Yellowknife, and hundreds of others. He regularly engaged with Casey and Crystal during the terraforming process. 45,000 people elected to live as the Indians back in the day, making up over 600 tribes, each tribe comprising 50 to 200 humans. Dave was my friend, but I hadn't seen him since I arrived in Sierra. When Dave was on the earth, he wasn't what you would call a decent man. He was an alcoholic by the time he turned 17. He had a photographic memory, and instead of using it for an honorable purpose, he applied it to scam casinos in Vegas. Scamming them didn't make him money quick enough, so he robbed one. He got caught and spent 4.5 years in prison. Afterward, the courts banned him from entering any casino as a condition of his parole. His father was a local true-believing preacher on the Cheyenne reservation. Dave always told his dad, "This world is so screwed up, who in their right mind wants to live forever? Won't it be more of the same?" His words often broke his father's heart. Dave had not seen his father, or his family, for several years. Until his father came down with cancer, which only intensified his hostility towards God. When Dave heard his dad was near death with only a few days to live, he decided he should go visit him. While standing beside his father's bed, he recognized the joy his father expressed on his face. "So," he asked, "how in the world can you be this happy, Dad?" "I am both happy and sad, son. Happy because I am going home, sad because I fear I'll never see you again. So, I am holding on with all my might to persuade you to turn your life around, and to say goodbye. I love you with my whole heart, son. I wish you understood what I do about heaven, what is awaiting those of us who trust in Christ," he replied as he contended for a breath. Dave once told me he felt awkward and ashamed because of what his father said to him. He sensed his dad was happy, excited even through his misery, but his happiness made no sense to Dave. He asked his dad, "Isn't the next world going to be more of the same garbage? How can that make you happy, father?" "Son, we are told, when in heaven, we would be given the ambitions of our heart. It's what is on the other side of this life where we genuinely live." "David, don't keep rejecting Jesus. Call on him, he will answer you, then you will understand," he replied, shifted his head, and passed away. Dave couldn't force that moment out of his head. It took 3 years of plunging deeper into his pit until one day it became so bad he wanted to commit suicide. He remembered the scriptures. He had a photographic memory. Yet, he didn't remember Sunday school, church service, or his dad's sermons. He did not remember one Sunday morning song he sang as a child. He had been cheated, and he assumed it was his dad he had forgotten, but it was memories of Jesus he cast aside. Dave knelt right then to pray and must have prayed and wept for hours until it all came back. Once it did, he realized what he needed. He needed to turn his life back to Christ. 3 years later he took over as pastor of his father's church. He introduced many stray and troubled souls to Christ. Louis landed at the edge of a creek in an open field, facing an encampment of teepees a short distance away. I exited Louis. Bart told me he had other things to accomplish, so he and Louis returned home. I strolled up to the camp and saluted my friend David. "Hi, Jeff," he said as he reached out to shake my hand. "Hi Dave," I replied and reached out to shake his. "How are you?" I asked. He at once noticed a difference as he looked at me skeptically. He then said a bit cautiously, "I am great. How are you, my friend?" I said, "I have some explaining to do," then suggested, "Let's walk and talk." I told him what happened, as I assume I acted strangely. He kept shaking his head and repeating, huh. It was virtually becoming comical. "Stop it," I said out loud. He chuckled, then asked, "Are you here for the buffalo?" Apparently I replied, as if I understood what he meant. Then he said, "Are you hungry? Let's have something to eat," as he turned back towards the camp. It was evening, and the sun was low, just another spectacular sunset in Sierra. I guess all the sunsets were perfect in Sierra. Well, sunset is the most relaxing part of the day. A forest lay on the other side of the creek where I landed. Beyond the forest, all the way to the horizon, lay a high snow-capped mountain range. As the sun was retiring, those mountains lit up like fire, glimmering against the dark violet sky. I guessed it must have been middle or late spring. Again, all the habitable planets in the system ran on the same 24-hour day, and 360-day year, but days, time zones, and seasons were scattered like confetti. It might be day here, or night there, or fall here, and spring there. It was a lot of work remembering what time of day or year you were traveling to or from. I was growing used to going along with whatever time or season it was. We ate vegetables, with smoked fish and venison for dinner. We sat talking by the campfire into the middle of the night. He, I, and another young man sat at the fire, mulling over my situation, establishing several scenarios why I was here, but none of them fit what I was thinking. I figured the other young man was another tribe member, but it turned out to be Dave's father. We stood up and hugged as I told him how good it was to see him. I should have recognized him. He understood. Dave mentioned he and a group of other men from the tribe had recently come back from the annual convention of fish. All the tribes assembled at the Salmon River for the annual fishing trip. Thousands of men would bring their nets and catch hundreds of thousands of king, silver, and sockeye salmon that spawned in the creeks and lakes which emptied into the river itself. So, it must have been early summer, as that is when the sockeye run. The tribes spent 2 weeks on the river catching and then drying, or smoking their catch. Each year every tribe caught enough fish to feed all of their people until the next year's gathering. I loved the smoked fish because it tasted so fresh. During our conversation, when we ran out of reasons for my condition, I got a chance to perform as a watcher. Dave had questions and asked me for consultation. Normally, a person would bring issues up with a local mediator, after that the resident council, whose representative would then take it to the governor of the area. When that didn't resolve the issue, they took it to the assigned watcher for that planet. Dave was the assigned watcher for Prairie. Each populated planet had a watcher, 136 at the moment. Each watcher accepted responsibly for representing their planet at any of the governmental hearings, or meetings in the City of Commerce. All the planetary watchers answered to the Council of 15, called the Council. The Council had thousands of advisors and support staff to help process all matters. Dave asked me because I was in camp, and I was the lead council member. Naturally, being good friends made the conversation more likely. We discussed the matter together, but I said nothing about my situation and how it might affect my side of the conversation. Oh well, I was eager to get my 2 cents in. The Council of 15 would meet for 3 consecutive days each month, longer if needed, in the City of Commerce. The Council had the ultimate voice in all matters regarding Sierra. There were other subgroups engaged in daily meetings in commerce. Such groups were the halls and the guilds. A hall or guild represented all workers in Sierra. If an issue concerned the farmers, for example, the farmers' hall would have to be involved in the resolution process. The City of Commerce hosted thousands of meetings every day, which included different halls and guilds, so no group or profession unintentionally damaged another group or profession without their rightful input. Dave's issue regarded a chain of 7 islands off the coast of 6 rivers, comparable to the Hawaiian Islands back on Earth. Those islands interested a group of Polynesians. The group, comprising 2,000, desired to occupy 3 of the islands. Currently, the islands were a habitat for seals and iguanas. The Polynesian Council asked Dave to consider allowing them to move onto the 3 islands. The current designation of the islands had to be changed to allow them to move there. Dave inclined to answer yes, and he had the proper authority to do so. He asked if I perceived anything that would prevent him from doing so. I asked him, what about the tribe that has the legal right to the islands? They were supporting the move. The obstacle wasn't the people, but the habitat, he replied. Oh boy, my first real act as a watcher. I considered the question for a moment. Aren't we for people, Dave? I assume Sierra can find thousands of islands to breed seals or iguanas. I said it like I knew what I was doing. Of course, I was right, which relieved Dave. He concluded he wanted to meet with members of the council in commerce to avert any repercussions. In Sierra, the size of the chain of government was established by the population of each planet. Sierra instituted a larger chain of management for larger populations, smaller chain for smaller populations. Prairie had a small population compared to other planets in the system, and it was a unique planet in how it was used. Uniquely, Prairie was populated by adventurous groups of people who wanted to live in particular eras of history. Prairie was 42,000 miles in circumference. The land mass was 318 million square miles, 5 to 6 times the land mass of the Earth. These types of measurements are invariably compared to the Earth. It provided plenty of room or space for anyone who preferred to live in such a way. The oldest historical group of people who adopted this manner of existence was 650,000 who lived in the ancient Greek-Roman era. Hundreds of architects and historians live in that community. Currently, 3 cities had been established covering 150 square miles. The largest city was named Helena, and it was a magnificent place, full of libraries, cool fountains, and long walking paths with Greek halls for plays and other entertainment, truly an attractive tourist draw. If you were engaged in any form of entertainment in Sierra, you wanted to pick up a gig in Helena. These historical communities are not temporary communities either. Although, a person could leave such a community any time they wished, most have remained since the idea was put forth. Pointing at myself, it was my idea. All Syrians love vacationing in these time pockets of history. 5 million or more people settled in these historical ways. Regardless of where or when people lived, the children in Sierra attended the same schools 3 days per week, the minimum period of attendance. So, no child was disconnected from the rest of Sierra or other groups of children. Early the next morning, I walked down to the side of the creek where a young blonde-haired boy, this familiar young boy of 6, was fishing. Many who chose particular lifestyles were not always of the same ethnicity. It did not matter, as anyone was free to live in whatever manner one desired, or time frame. Dave always chuckled when he mentioned a group of young married couples who decided they wanted to live like Indians in the Old West. They didn't have a clue what they were doing, Dave would tell me. They put up the teepees okay, but the electronics had to go, as he struggled to keep from laughing. That's Dave. Good morning, how are you, young man? I said. Fine, he replied. He had a pile of trout off to his side which now made sense. First, he glanced at his fish, then looked at me with his full smile. He asked, "You want to fish, mister?" I replied, "Okay, sure. I would love to." He handed me a line wrapped around a stick with a hook and a bug on the end. No pole. I watched him throw his line halfway across the creek. He twisted it back onto his stick, stopping every couple of feet. Sure enough, the third time he paused, he had a fish on. So, I tossed my line halfway across the creek to do precisely as he did. Nothing. He dragged his fish in, then laid it on the pile he was accumulating. I must have tossed the line 20 times, catching nothing. The kid turned and said, "Watch what I am doing. Do as I do." I was, but I guess not, as he hauled in another fish. He stared at me, shook his head, took his line back, and told me, "Better luck next time, mister." I turned to see Dave standing behind us smiling at me. As we returned to the camp, he remarked, "Jeff, we call him Little Big Fish." He preferred catching fish than anything else. Ah. Okay, I replied as I turned back to look at the young professor. Apparently, the child was a friend of one of John's kids. Dave told me so when I mentioned encountering the boy at the park in Edmonton. For the rest of the day, we scouted. Dave needed to inspect several herds of elk. He wanted to count and analyze the condition of each, particularly the herd leaders. It was the rutting season. The bucks were crazy searching for mates before heading up into the mountains for the summer. He also wanted to single out the better of the mature bucks for harvesting before they did. So, we spent the next 2 days inspecting and corralling several mature bucks. Elk meat was popular among the camps. When he said harvesting, he meant catching for seeding the animals so the meat could be cultivated. Humans would catch the finest of their herds, place them in a pen for a week, feed them, and then harvest the seeds. Tribes grew the meat themselves and especially liked making jerky from it. The next morning, following that harvest, all the men got up early as the buffalo were expected any day, and they preferred to be on the prairie before the first herd arrived. I was provided a spirited black and white paint. We packed up our horses with enough gear to last for a week or more. We planned to camp beside the prairie at least until the lead herd of buffalo came through. An hour into our ride, we came out on an expansive prairie. It laid out for miles in 3 different directions. With exception of the forest behind us, I could see it stretched all the way to the mountains. Those same mountains I was appreciating the first night. I guess I looked bewildered because Dave reminded me how the prairie ran for thousands of miles in either direction, and several hundred miles at its widest. We set up camp then sat down to drink coffee and eat small wheat cakes. I saw eagles mingling with the hawks flying overhead. Prairie dogs and jackrabbits popped up all over. A 6-foot rattlesnake fell out of a bush next to me. I held my feet up as it slithered on by and nobody seemed to pay attention. Except me. It escaped into the expanse of the prairie. The prairie itself was a most exceptional sight, as it was in full bloom with wildflowers, tall grasses and colorful bushes. It smelled of dirt, blooms, and 1,000 other sweet smells, depending on which way the breeze came or the direction you turned your head. We spent the first day setting up camp and erecting a pen for the buffalo. In the calm of evening we relaxed around a campfire drinking Indian prairie tea while talking about the many buffalo hunts. We bedded down in the open with only one moon in the sky. It was full and hid all the stars while lighting up the whole prairie. I saw the mountains in the distance with their glowing snow caps. If nothing else, every place in Sierra was stunning. I sat on my bedroll into the next morning staring out over the prairie. That afternoon, I sat down to eat lunch, which was our second day when the ground shook. It was slight, but shaking. Everyone grew excited and mounted their horses. I crammed my sandwich into my mouth as I mounted mine. We waited while the shaking became more violent. I looked to the right, south of us when I detected a dirt cloud moving in our direction. It took 10 minutes for the buffalo to come into view. There must have been a couple 100,000 buffalo. The animals were trotting, not stampeding. Even so, the ground shook vigorously. Dave turned saying we need to remove 7 leaders with their mates from the head of the first herd. These leaders were the second in line to lead the herd. They never pulled the leader, only the young studs who might confront him, young healthy scrappers who always ran with the first herd. The herd appeared to have 60 lead buffalo. Part of Dave's functions in Sierra was to manage all the diverse wildlife on prairie. His responsibility included capturing and transporting various kinds of animals around Sierra for re-establishment. Dave was the leading authority in repatriation of wildlife. As I mentioned, he always helped during the terraforming process of new planets. Prairie was a breeding ground for many species of animals, reptiles and fowl. We had to capture 7 lead buffalo then transport them to another habitat in Sierra. With a loud hoot, each rider, swinging his rope, took off into the herd. Now, the herd stampeded, and it was an impressive sight watching so many buffalo, with horseback riders right in the middle. Well, if you could see them as they often disappeared in the clouds of dust. I rode outside the herd. Even though my horse proved swift and kept up comfortably, I remained out of the way as much as possible. Even so, I could not resist riding into the middle of the stampede twice. How thrilling! Not only did these men, young men, have to single out the right bulls, they had to rope them and separate them from the herd. At the pace they were moving, it seemed like an insurmountable task, as the buffalo ran so hard. All of them weighed over a ton, and not one of them feared us. I saw one man, a 14-year-old young man, had roped one. With his rope bound around the horn of his saddle, he was drawing the animal to the side of the stampeding herd. Normally the humans rode bareback, but removing one of these animals out of the herd was too demanding to pull them barehanded. So, it was the one time they used saddles. Once outside the herd, he halted and held the animal. A couple minutes afterward, 10 smaller female buffalo came sprinting towards the captured male. "Nice catch," I said, as I smiled. He was excited for the nice size bull. Over the next 5 miles, they had roped 6 other bulls and pulled to the side. They captured 7 bulls with 63 females. I dismounted my horse, then walked up to one male. He was massive and weighed over 2,000 pounds. I reached up and scratched his head, and he seemed to appreciate that. I guess he had an itch. The herd displayed no fear here, only the chase. It implied the animals liked it as much as we did. We placed them into the makeshift pens we set up the first day we got there. It took over 4 hours for the whole of the herd to pass by. After all the activity, the herd quieted down back to a trot and meandered off to the north. The next couple of days we spent checking out the animals in the pens while viewing the remaining herds migrating north. 7 herds passed, I suppose over a couple million animals. On the 6th day, Dave called for transportation. A transport craft settled down next to us. It did not take long to load the buffalo on board. Once loaded, the craft lifted off. After the animals were transported, it was Dave's policy to go check on each of the transferred animals to make certain they were doing well in their new location. We stayed another 2 days on the prairie to make sure no more straggling herds were left to pass. The day after the last of the buffalo passed, I noted the prairie had sprung back as if the buffalo had never been there. The rabbits, prairie dogs and the other small creatures either got out of the way or hid burrows deep enough to survive. I'm surprised wildlife and nobody else got crushed. How incredible. We broke down our campsite and returned to the encampment. I spent another 3 days there. Dave and I conducted a lot of scouting and horseback riding. I devoted an afternoon fishing with my little comrade. I must report I have never faced such a condescending kid in my life. It was entertaining, and what's with the Mr. thing? Oh well. I am sure that kid will go far in his endeavors. I headed home and spent 2 days there. It was midsummer in Somnolent. And for the heat which I loved, I was guzzling a soda and inhaling a peanut butter and jelly sandwich when for whatever odd reason I thought of Cedar. I believe it had to do with the weather. It was like someone had slapped me upside the head. I asked Dana what time of year was it on Cedar. I couldn't remember. She informed me it depended on where in Cedar I was referring to. I guess I, unconsciously, had a particular place in mind. Hence the question without detail in mind. Hence the question without detail in mind. Hence the question without detail in mind.